like to do when I start a talk is to really understand, it's a little hard to see right now, but like, who's in the audience? Who are you people that, have, made it all this way to this conference? So it's a little hard for me to see, but I assume that some of you in here consider yourselves visual designers. Like you come from the graphic arts and you design for the web with a focus on visual. If you are one of those people, tell me, raise your hand. Okay. And how many of you are coders? Someone who actually builds the front-end experience? Wow, there's a lot. That's actually, you might even be dominant here. Have you had any cheering matches or something? And then how many of you consider yourself UX people, like user experience designers, information architects, interaction designers? Okay, that's pretty good. And how many of you have no idea what you do? You're just like, okay, all right. I figured there's some of that. Okay. Well, a little bit about me. I am currently working as a creative director at RGA. My background, my area of expertise is in what I now call experience design. As Robert said, I've talked a lot about storytelling because I had an early first career. I'm old enough to actually have more than one career, and that was in filmmaking, and that sort of is where I've brought in the storytelling to a lot of my work. But if I were to think of all the things that I either do and or make or have over the course of my life, I'd have a list like this. It's considerably shortened on Twitter, but you see the things. And what I think is interesting is if I were to tell you this is sort of an accurate, these are some things that make up me, but a more accurate representation of me would look something like this. And I assume, how many of you have heard the Malcolm Gladwell thing about 10,000 hours? There's this idea that in order to truly become an expert at what one does, you not only need lots of practice, but you need about 10,000 hours of practice to be able to do that. And do you know how many years of full-time work that adds up to? Does anybody know offhand? 10? It's actually 5. If you do the math, it's about 5 years of full-time work at any one thing. And I started to do some loose calculations. I used to do the sketch thing when I was much younger, and it's I really just kind of didn't get anywhere with that. And this is also across the time of my life as well. So I started out doing cinematography, which led to screenwriting, and I didn't do it full-time over 5 years, but over the course of 15 years, I probably did put in those 10,000 hours. And what I'm trying to get to is that when you think about all that stuff that you do, and that you put your time towards, what is it that you're really an expert at? And so if I did that, my graph would look sort of like this. And these are the things that I feel like I've mastered in some form or another, and therefore, as a result of mastering, I hope I can say that I then, therefore, have a really strong craft in these areas. And as a creative director, my job, I didn't put that on there because that, to me, is a job title, not something that actually creates something. But what I do is I manage and work with teams and try and create the best conditions for them to create good work. I look across all disciplines. I look at interaction design. I look at visual. I look at copy, even though my native area of expertise comes in UX. And I'm looking at the holistic experience. And as a result of that, I spend a lot of time thinking about how to be a better mentor, and how people learn, and how people work, and how people train. And that's what really interests me about this topic that Robert brought up, because I feel like it's worth really thinking about what craft means in a digital space, and how it's possibly the same and or different than the way we think of craft in other ways. So the teacher in me thought, you know what, I have to break this down. Unfortunately, I don't think anyone's quite done this yet, because I was worried about repeating 5 other speakers that preceded me, but I really wanted to take some time to not only give context to this presentation, but to get you all thinking for a minute about this thing called craft and what it means. It's kind of interesting because I think it's important because I've been in so many situations where I've either interviewed people or worked with team members who have come, straight out of grad school, and they want a senior role right away, because they feel like they've learned this stuff and they're ready to go. And I said, well, you haven't really done this stuff yet, or you haven't done it very long. And I think we all have different notions about what craft is and how good we are at our craft at various points. And so I'd like to ask you to really think about that during the course of this presentation and how it translates into your work. So the definition that came to my mind about craft, and really thinking about it, was this idea of the thoughtful, meaning something that's very deliberate and consciously practiced, and consistent, meaning you can do it over and over again, application of mastered. You've done it for a while, you know it really, really, really well. It often results in great work practices. This feels like a pretty acceptable definition of craft. Does this sound okay to you? Yeah? Okay. So the issues around craft are often, all right, well, how do I get it? I mean, I'm from a generation where they didn't have master's degrees in interaction design. I came from a completely different discipline. A lot of it was either self-taught and or taught with mentors and people that actually had been doing it before and knew a lot of stuff that I didn't do that I can learn from. So how do we get it? We get it on a lot of practice. And maybe not 10,000 hours. 10,000 hours to me means you become an expert and you've actually mastered it, but you can get craft along the way to that. But the important thing is that you spend a lot of time practicing it. Now, the one thing that I think people often forget is the guidance piece. How many of you in this audience feel like you can say that you, at some point or another, if not now, have actually had a mentor to help you with your work? Okay, this doesn't even look like half, as far as I can tell, the audience. And I think that's really interesting and also a big challenge for people, especially if you're working alone as a freelancer, especially if you're someone who is in a context, for whatever reason, that you've always been the best person there, and there's been no one better than you, or that you would admit to being better than you. And I think this is so key to developing craft, even in that traditional sense of the atelier, or being able to apprentice to a cobbler or something like that in order to actually learn from someone who truly has mastered it. And I've seen people who've come in and not having had the benefit of that kind of mentorship, that kind of guidance, and not really knowing what they were missing until they were in a position where they were able to get that feedback. And it's amazing how they were able to grow so much more quickly and completely transform the way they do things with that kind of guidance. So it's very, very important in how to get craft. And then, if you've been lucky enough to get craft or feel like you've started to earn and really know your practice very well, you know, it's like, when do you know when you really, really have it? And I think that there are some key points. And the first one is that it's, you've internalized an approach. You no longer have to think consciously, oh, this is step 1, step 2, step 3, and then that gets to that. You actually kind of do it automatically, and it feels very natural. Before I ended up being a designer, I went to graduate school in screenwriting, because after years of working as a cinematographer or camera assistant, I decided I wanted to make my own things and learn how to write. And one of my first teachers said it took me her 7 years to find her voice, which is the equivalent of a craft. I'm like, oh, you're kidding me. I need 2 years, 2 years and I'm going to be done. I'm going to be out of here. And you know what? She was actually right. It took 5 full screenplays before I felt like I could truly internalize and understand the rules of dramatic structure. And that was over time. But it really, really took that constant work, constant thinking until you actually know that very well. And so I would ask you to think about, are you at that place? Do you feel like whatever it is you do, whether it's visual design, graphic design, UX, whatever that process is, how internalized is it? And I think that leads to this idea that when you get there, you're able to make well-judged decisions quickly. And I say well-judged because it's easy for all of us to make decisions quickly. I see it all the time. People say, oh, that's great, that's the one, that's the thing that works. That's what we need. But they sort of do it in a way that's maybe not so well informed because it's just what they know and they don't see the limitations. But it's important to know when you have it, when you can justify and say why about every decision that you make. And it's also, the work is going to be of consistent high quality. So that goes without saying, that's a part of it. Output, more often than not, we're still going to do bad stuff and not everything is great, but by and large, this person can be relied upon to do consistently good work. And then finally, can you teach what you do? This is actually one of the shortcuts, I think, to mastering. If you don't want to spend your 10,000 hours, spend a lot of time teaching, and you probably can get to some kind of masterful grasp of your craft. But if you want to learn something, take the opportunity to try and teach it and try and mentor someone else and help them grow. And I think this is actually really important. So that's my take on craft. But the thing that I started to think about is what this actually means in a digital space. Before I do that, how many of you can honestly say you have mastered your craft? All right, we've got a very honest audience here. That's awesome. I love that. So, because my next question was going to say, of those who thought you'd mastered it, how many of you have actually been doing it for more than 5 years? All right, excellent. So that's one way of thinking about craft, but I've been thinking a lot about craft lately in a digital space because things are different. We're not dealing with tangible objects. We're dealing with a lot of intangibles that contribute to the things that we make. Like as in UX, there are flow charts and there are diagrams that feed into the actual interface, but you don't actually see the designs that are the actual physical design that actually gets built. And so it looks a little bit like this. We get an idea based on knowledge and goals and user needs that we put out there. And then that knowledge is then pushed out and translated, and someone starts to explore what the shape may be. And it becomes a little bit different than our original idea. And you put it in the hands of a visual designer, an interaction designer, it becomes still different. And then you give it to a coder, and it's like very, very different, or starts to adjust a little bit. And then you launch it. Maybe it has a slightly different shape, and then maybe you're learning to test and learn and iterate after people are actually being used it to become something else. And so there's a lot of change. There's a lot of iteration in what we do. It's always evolving. So how does a craft apply to a situation like that? And in fact, you actually spend a lot of time doing this. Talking and in meetings, trying to align on what the best approach is, what the best design is, that sort of thing. And have you ever, has anyone said to you after you've told them that a website that you've been working on come to you and said, hey, I went and checked out your website. I bet there must have been an awesome content matrix behind that. No, because they don't see that stuff. But that is part of our craft, and that's what we do. And the people in this room are actually spending time doing something very important that's going to really contribute to the outcome of whatever it is they're doing. So until recently, in this digital space, we have, I believe, a process that a lot of people follow that seems to be drastically changing. And the process was, you'd have, an idea, a concept based on business goals, user needs, et cetera, and you start to maybe think about, all right, what's the structure and organization, the architecture of that experience, how does that work, then get into the visual and interaction design, and then someone would start to code it and build it. And each of those things would be pretty much owned and attended to by, different roles. What's different, and then you'd arrive at your end product, which is a website. Hooray! But now the world has completely changed. And in the context of RGA, we're not just working on websites anymore. We're working on entire ecosystems of functionally integrated applications and experiences that are completely changing the way we work. And we talk a lot about ecosystems at RGA as something that, is imperative not only for a business, but also presents new design challenges. For example, when we build a website, we're not just thinking of the website anymore. We're thinking about the tablet. We're thinking about the mobile application. You can't not think suddenly about social and where that fits into it and where the intersections are. It's all the data that connects all of these devices and experiences. How does that work? And how do we seamlessly guide a user through an experience that feels like it's part of the same thing? And so these are all new sorts of design challenges and questions that didn't come up before. I'm working on something now, and it's literally an ecosystem. It's a B2B2C thing, an ecosystem of applications for a company, and we're building 3 or 4 of them simultaneously. And while we build them, we have to understand what the commonalities are across all these components simultaneously. In other words, which components, which experience elements, which graphical elements, how does the data all connect? I mean, it's incredibly complex. And consequently, we now are thinking of craft in terms of something that's not only intangible, a lot of it is, before it gets to be a final product, but it's really complex in today's world, and it's always changing. So if that's the case, what is that definition of craft that I was talking about earlier? How does it play in this context? Is it different? Because websites are not shoes, right? So in a digital space, my feeling is that craft is not just about mastering a practice or a set of skills as a person who does something and focuses on that area of expertise, but it's about how we think. That's part of our craft, and it's how we collaborate, because it's absolutely essential in a space that's becoming so complex. At RGA, we actually value collaboration deeply, and we talk a lot about bringing in multiple disciplines, because you need to do that in order to solve these bigger problems. So what I would like to do is to have you, what do we have? We have another 25 minutes or so. I'm going to pretend that I'm your creative director for a little while, and I'm going to talk about some tips that I've picked up over time around how one might start to think of craft and protect it and cultivate it in this new complex digital space. And so the first thing is, start being craftful in your thinking. Yeah. So what this means is your craft is clearly a product of your thinking. And we usually think of it as like literally what we're doing with our hands, the output and all of that. But what I've noticed in working with a lot of teams, that the way a person goes about, that the way they've trained themselves to approach the work very much impacts the results on a day-to-day basis. And craftful thinking is really about, one, ensuring that the next step, when we get to collaboration, is going to be possible. It's ensuring that you'll be open to possibilities beyond your first best stab. It's that you'll be actively open to seeing how your work can be improved. And it's also the space that will enable you to open up to new ideas. And so one of the examples that I have often come around or encountered is the kind of person who feels so certain and arrives at a solution or a design really quickly and sort of stops. And to me, that's the idea. That's a person who has one way of doing things. They've learned it. It's worked in other instances, but they haven't really moved beyond it. And to me, that's kind of like the hammer always looking for the nail. Have you ever heard that expression? And so when you have a hammer looking for a nail, like if you give a kid a little toy hammer, the kid's going to think that everything around it needs the hammer for some reason. And it's the solution to everything. And have any of you experienced anyone like this in your jobs? Sometimes? And so that's the thing you want to avoid. You don't want to like having like one thing that you rely on that you sort of end up applying to everything else. How do you push beyond that? There's the other type. There's the person who spends a lot of time going really deep, which is awesome, but they are so overanalyzing and going so deep that they get themselves lost in the knots and are finding it difficult to even step back and see what it is that they're doing. Does this sound familiar? Yeah. So this is sort of like, this is another side of it. And I think that we can all be any one of these at any one time for that matter, but it's actually a very easy trap to get into. So when you're being craftful in your thinking, to me, that's really about having a mind or an approach that looks more like this. And what that means is you oscillate between this uncritical and sort of divergent mode. It's the place where you're not second-guessing yourself, you're not being overcritical, but you're allowing yourself to sort of like push beyond your expectations of where even you can go. And then after you work in that mode for a while, you pull back and you get into this more critical and convergent mode. You're actually looking for a clear path to solutions, looking for ways to recombine and align, and actually you're self-criticizing. But you can't do all of those at the same time. But after you do that, you need to do a little bit more of the outward and inward, and this becomes a sort of process. And I've seen when designers are able to do this, I've found that they're not only much happier because they're just not driving themselves, into a corner, but they work better. They work with other people better because they know when they're doing either thing. And this was one of the lessons I learned very, very early on in screenwriting because it's so hard and you want to be critical at every way. I mean, how many of you have actually written a paper, remember writing a paper in college where you didn't just do a first draft, you actually wrote sentence by sentence, word by word? Like, that's the, getting into the knots piece. And it doesn't work. It's not a good approach to your craft. So this kind of thinking also enables you to expand and explore so many more possibilities. One of the things I always see is that when people sketch, we believe in sketching before we do everything. And I actually believe in getting everyone involved in sketching. It's not just the designers, it's the coders, it's the producers, it's everyone at a certain stage. But I'll talk to someone and say, so yeah, did you do some sketching? Did you think about, doing these quick iterations before you actually start to put something in design or in a wireframe? And the designer says, yeah, I did a sketch. Well, how many did you do? And they might say, yeah, I did 2. And I said, all right, you know what? You should go back and do like 20 more. Sketching, pushing further, not arriving too quickly is actually really important for our work. And I think this kind of craftful thinking is what allows us to do there. So the big takeaways for this piece is that find ways to move between that uncritical and critical space. Also, ask yourself, are you iterating enough? And all of us do different types of things, but I think it's just very important. And then don't be a hammer looking for a nail, because that's really annoying most of the time. So the next thing is look beyond your discipline. This is actually really key, and it's the soul of collaborating. And I've learned a lot over the years about collaboration, especially in film production, which has been an amazing model for how people collaborate. And I've also learned from other things and read a great book by Wynton Marsalis called, oh my God, the name just escaped me. I'll come up with it later. But anyway, but he talks a lot about his experiences as a jazz musician and how when you're playing in an ensemble, you've got a bunch of players, you're on different instruments, you may have a leader, but at any one point, you know when to sort of step up and when to step back. You know when someone else needs to take the lead and you don't. And that's a key to actually thinking about other disciplines and actually and being a better collaborator. And so when you think of that old model that we had where we had more, a process whereas individuals would take on their piece and then pass it on to the next. In this new world, we need to think of ourselves as that little jazz band. So, and there are certain cases where we do need to do it together. And I believe like early on in a project when we're concepting, we're developing things, that's when we bring different disciplines and voices into the room and we allow them to sort of bring their piece in. Because if you haven't talked to a technologist and you're thinking about a concept and you wait until the very end, you may not even be able to do that, or that technologist could have had an idea that could have made it so amazing that you weren't able to bring to the table yourself because that's not your discipline. So when you're in a situation like that, that's a great way to actually integrate other disciplines and think of yourself as that jazz band. And there are cases where it's not always everyone doing everything at once. I mean, collaboration actually requires a leader. I think that's another misconception that people have about collaboration. It's something that it's not like four people compromise to a solution. That's the worst form of collaboration, but it's about everyone contributes ideas and brings things to the table that gets to an even better idea. But sometimes you're someone working, you just need inputs. And this is, to me, also a kind of collaboration where, let's say I'm an information architect and I'm actually looking at all the data structures and taxonomies, et cetera, and I probably want to get some input from the technologist as well as the strategist, who's ever doing strategy, et cetera. The same thing from a coding perspective. No one needs to really check my code, but they might want to like look in and make sure that everything else is working. So that's something that's really important. And what we've also been doing is with clients, we've been doing a lot of collaborative sketching with the clients. I mean, how many of you actually work in a client situation where you actually work with other companies doing your work? And how many of you work like internally, like at a company that has a design practice or something? So most of you are actually working with clients, it sounds like, but there's a mix. And this is awesome. If you ever have a chance to try it, to actually not as a way of necessarily getting at the actual design, because you are the experts, by the way, but it's a way to actually start to get out ideas and to see where people align and where they don't, and also to understand where the problems are. And so these collaborative sessions have been amazing, because in this room, in this example that you see right now, there are technologists, there's a business person, there's, our team is in there as well, the producer's with us sketching. And they've been really, really amazing sessions. So the key takeaways for this are, know when to step forward and know when to step back. That is the key to collaboration. And you want to make sure that you integrate others into your process where it's right. That's so hugely important. And then seek input from others outside of your process, and also, I didn't really talk about this, but I think this is so important, is that when you do work with other people, you have to trust that they know what they're doing and that they have something of value to bring to the table. All right, the next thing for collaboration in a digital space. When you talk about mastery and mastering a craft, it kind of gives you the idea that you reach an end state and you've learned all you needed to learn, and that's going to carry you for the rest of your life. Well, it ain't going to happen in what we do. And I can't tell you how many times I've seen people who have sort of taken a stall in their career because they stopped learning. And at every age, not only in their 20s, in their 50s, whenever. And I don't know if you've ever heard this idea of like serial mastery, but it's becoming increasingly important that we continue to not only add things to our toolkit on one hand, but we actually learn within the context of what we're doing as well and apply that to the thing. So to me, iteration and learning are like your carpenter's plane of the digital project. It's the thing that allows us to keep mastering and keep honing everything that we do. And as I was saying, it might be about learning something new or applying it to the context of your work. And I just want to give you an example. of how we approach it. So at RGA, we tend to like look at this very like simple view of the design process, and we have to communicate it to a client or something, and this is how we talk about it. We have distinct phases of discovery and planning, and these overlapping circles, which are like cycles, where we end up with an experience strategy, design, a technology implementation, and then we can continue to measure and analyze. But this is not to say that this is also a waterfall process, but it's just to say there are overlapping pieces. At each stage, there are new learnings, and learnings that tell us what is a thing, how does it work, how do we build it, and then how is it going to be performing. But when you break down that design piece, we started to think about, especially in the project that I mentioned earlier that is so complex, we can't, by any stretch, get all the information we need to be able to make the best solution up front. Because it's too big, it's too complex, there are always going to be things that we don't know, and we have to kind of give into that. So we started to think of this idea of a design sprint. Do any of you work in an agile type environment in terms of how you code? So this is not really working, it's kind of like a modified agile, as you'll see we're talking about it, but from just a design perspective. This is not about coding at all right now. This is about getting from a concept to wireframes to maybe a visual design. And what we're trying to do is to create these cycles that go through these phases along the way. And then during the course of a project, we design sprints that tackle certain components or chunks of that experience. And then while we do that, there's going to be new learnings, and something that happens in sprint 3 may actually completely affect what's in change, which in sprint 1, and you know what, that's okay. It's something that we're prepared to do. We understand we're going to have to adjust as we learn new things. And then on top of that, we're actually thinking of how these interplay with dev sprints, because the client we're working right now does do agile development of a kind, and so they're building things as we're designing them and constantly sort of like linking up into these kinds of cycles. So this is just one example, and I'm sure you can think of in your context many different ways where you might rethink how you can constantly learn or use those learnings to better your craft and make the things that you do even of higher quality. So key takeaways: go in deep. It's important to learn and to understand in a reasonable amount of time what you're doing. Shift your mental model, so from processes. I know there are some project managers here, from linear to iterative. It's actually really key, and you've got to be flexible, and you want to be prepared to change your approach as things change. We're trying this model out now. We might find, in 6 months' time that we have to do something else. But I think that's the hard part with organizations right now, because we have such a established way of doing, and to get people to change is really difficult. But it's an imperative. We really need to figure out ways to do that, to be able to create good work and to preserve craft in the situations. And so the last thing is, yes, find ways to incite change then. Now, a lot of you are probably not in the position where you can actually go in and say, oh, we're going to change this production process and do some things differently and go to our clients and have collaborative sketch sessions. But you can start to talk about it with the people who do. And you can be proactive about it. Because this is the most important and the most difficult thing. It's something that I'm becoming interested in as well. As you can see at the far end of that graph, I started business consulting was popping up. I never thought, I've always been doing creative stuff, but suddenly this is a creative problem to me. Organizational issues, how people do things, how we can do it better, because it is an experience that needs to be designed. And so preserving craft, this is hugely important, requires setting up the right conditions, because no matter how well mastered or how well your intentions are about all of these things, if you don't have the right conditions, you're not going to be able to do it, and consequently, it's going to impact your craft. It's really key. So some of the organizational roadblocks that I feel like I've seen, you may have others that you've thought of, are, first of all, is having a non-agile project management approaches. I'm not sure about that word because I don't mean literally agile, but really being able to think, you know what, for this project we may need to do something differently rather than here's the way we communicate and put things into our project plan and then communicate it to the client. Budgets that count resource hours. This is something we struggle with at RGA because you have to figure out and make a swag. I don't know if you've heard that word. It's like a silly, wild-ass guess about how something costs. And the only way you can do that is sort of figure out number of resources over time and how many hours. But then the problem is when you start doing that, when you want to collaborate, you have a producer saying, hey, you can't use up those hours because you have to be doing your work. And so that doesn't help us in that situation. So what are some new models that we can think of? And then space that doesn't facilitate communication or collaboration. Some of you may have these beautifully designed offices where every wall is a whiteboard, and some of you may be in a small room in your home with 2 other people or what have you. You may not have the benefits of that, but I think that's one of the things that all of you could impact in some ways. What are the ways to expose the work, to put things, to build a creative climate and culture that actually facilitates craft? And then management doesn't encourage learning. I mean, frankly, I don't think I could work for a company that didn't encourage learning, but it's so important to find ways to get people to mentor, to be mentored, to go to conferences, to actually learn and find ways of doing it if they're not providing it themselves. And then the other big one is siloed team structures. We're working with the client now. Some companies are just set up a particular way. You know how it is with clients. You can't affect certain things in the work that you do because they are actually structured in a certain way that someone else takes care of that and you can't get close to it. Within your own teams, rethink how you actually integrate yourselves. We've been thinking a lot about this idea, and I'll talk about this in a minute, about cross-pollinating people in a way that actually allows for inputs more easily and more formally rather than having to kind of like race around and get it. A really great example of a place and a condition in a very particular time where the organization was specifically set up for creativity and innovation is this. Does anyone know what this picture is of? By any chance? Nope. This is probably, it could be, it's an American thing, but this is actually from the 60s. This is the Bell, it's called the Bell Labs. And there's some great articles online, but it is, we think of Google, we think of Apple, and Microsoft as cultures of innovation and doing all this stuff, but when you think about the case study of what they were doing at this particular time, it actually blows these guys out of the water. There was a lot of attention put to as a research lab where they were trying to understand. Bell Labs was a telephone company. It was formerly a monolith in the United States that then became AT&T. And they were not only researching things for telecommunications, but they were researching also just future advancements and innovations in technology. And so there was a scientist who became a chairman of the board who decided to design this lab, this space where he threw a lot of different disciplines over, and this long hallway that you see here was meant to ensure that you couldn't possibly walk down this long corridor without running into someone and getting diverted and hopefully learning or contributing to something where it would sort of facilitate those happy accidents that lead to great things. And I just find this so fascinating because they spent a lot of time thinking about the physical space, about how to build that culture, and it's something that I think we often lose sight of when we think about our craft because it is a key component of how we produce and how we work. And so some of the things that we've been trying to do is open design reviews. When we're in the middle of a design, like right now we have 5 different projects happening simultaneously. We have an open design review every day. People are scheduled to come in. Anyone who, other people, members on the team that are not required to be there can show up so that we all see what we're doing. People who are working on other projects can bring in their knowledge and say, hey, by the way, we're doing something very similar over here. Maybe this will help you. But it's helped a lot it's helped us make our work a lot better by doing this. We've also tried to talk about this integrated cross-pollinated team structures. So for example, if you're someone who's working on another team, You're invited on a weekly basis, sort of as an ambassador, to come and sit in on meetings if you can't do it every day, because we don't want to have too many meetings. How many of you feel like you can't get work done half the time because you have too many meetings? And that often happens, right? You just like, they start to creep up. And you're like, wait, I'm here to do work. When am I going to actually do the stuff that I need to do? So that's actually really hard. So, you know, that's one way of getting collaboration worked in more formally without having to take up, you know, being in multiple meetings. But for the meeting problem, we're also focusing on flow time, and very important for the environment. So what we said in our group, for anyone who's actually creating work and design and making stuff, they can't be scheduled for a meeting before 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock. All the meetings happen in the afternoon so that people come in, they're focused on their work, and we have the meetings, and then our design reviews are always at the end of the day. And this has helped enormously with people, because for craft, you need time. That's another piece. It's not just about, you know, learning and building, but it's the space to be able to work and to apply it in the right way. So finally, rethink your team structure. I think, I'm used to saying that in my job all the time. I never say I for some reason. So it's like, it's all we, it's all collective. But anyway, so rethink your team structure. Try and think about how you can create a culture of creativity in what you do. Give people time to work. Find ways, give yourself time to work. If you're not getting it, ask for it, because that's going to help improve your craft as well. And also be flexible enough to change when it seems necessary. So those are the things that I feel like are very important and are worth focusing on in this new age of intangible, complex, always changing things that we're building and creating. And so my new definition of craft is the thoughtful, I'll hold on to the beginning of it, consistent application of mastered yet evolving practices, and in collaboration with other disciplines. And so I hope with this that you can take away there's some thought starters or ideas that you can bring back to your own context, to the place you work, and see how you can actually continue to grow and evolve and protect and cultivate the craft that you have in your particular discipline. So that's it. Okay.